Greetings all, and welcome to Esoteric Babble. So now we come to the point in the setting the Dharma wheel in motion sutta, or the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, where the Buddha discusses what has come to be known as the Four Noble Truths. Before we can talk about these Four Noble Truths, however, we have to take up a slight technical matter. And that is, we have to discuss a word in Pali, and that word is dukkang. The reason we need to do this is because this word does not have a single English equivalent that can communicate the entire range of meanings that this word dukkang has. So what we're going to do is we're just going to kind of examine the word, and then we'll talk about how it is traditionally translated, because when translating, we have to settle on a word. You can always footnote it, but we have to settle on some kind of word. This word dukkang has two parts. It has du and kang. The ka part can be thought of as a hole, and specifically a hole that would go in the middle of a wheel for an axle. The du part means poorly placed. It's a prefix that comes up quite a bit in Pali. So it means badly, poorly, and in this case, poorly placed. So if you think about the consequence of a poorly placed center hole on a wheel, what you're going to get is a bumpy ride. And so we can think about dukkang when the Buddha uses this word is it's telling us that our lives have this element of a bumpy ride. It's not a smooth ride. Now, traditionally, when people translated this and still translate it, they use the word suffering. And the problem with suffering is that suffering is very specific. It is included in the range of meanings of dukkha, but it isn't the only meaning. So it's too narrow, in other words. Dukkha could be, and we'll see, actually the Buddha will talk about some of the, he'll give some examples of what dukkha is. It could be anxiety. It can be just kind of a feeling, some people will say, of bummerness, of unsatisfactoriness. So this is something we want to keep in mind when we talk about this word dukkang. In the translation, and I've chosen Bikkhu Bodhi's translation, the gold standard, I think, he uses the word suffering, but again, we have to understand that this word suffering is translating dukkha, and it actually has a wider range of meanings than just suffering. Now, and one little thing before we go on, the opposite word of dukkang, its antonym, is sukha, and that means a well-placed hole or axle, and that's usually easier to translate as happiness. Again, if we translated dukkha as unhappiness, it wouldn't quite get the full range, but we can think of dukkha as kind of being an unhappiness, and that can help us too. So the first noble truth, I'm just going to read it. Now this, bhikkhus, monks, is the noble truth of suffering. Birth is suffering. Aging is suffering. Illness is suffering. Death is suffering. Union with what is displeasing is suffering. Separation from what is pleasing is suffering. Not to get what one wants is suffering. In brief, the five aggregates subject to clinging are suffering. If you aren't familiar with Buddhism, this phrase, five aggregates subject to clinging, you may think, what is that? The way the Buddha understood a human being is that we're made up of these five different parts. One of them is the body. And then there are four other factors that are more or less mental. There is like feeling, and the kind of feeling that you would get by touching something. There's perception. There is kind of mental formations, and there's consciousness. So those are the 5 aggregates, khandhas in Pali. So he's saying basically being a human being involves having dukkha. So the Buddha talks about the fact that this exists, and we don't really need a lot of belief in order to agree with the Buddha. Actually, we don't need any belief at all. We can just kind of survey ourselves and ask if this seems correct or not. If it's not correct, then you can just kind of move along and not bother with this. But if there is some element of truth here, if you feel like there's anxiety and kind of longing, or despair, actual suffering, physical or mental, and like I said before, a bummerness about life, then you might kind of get on board. The next truth, and I will again read from Bikkhu Bodhi. Now this, bhikkhus, is the noble truth of the origin of suffering. It is this craving which leads to renewed existence, accompanied by delight and lust, seeking delight here and there. That is craving for sensual pleasures, craving for existence, craving for extermination. So we can see that the origin of suffering is bound up in craving. You can kind of get a sense for that in the first noble truth, where it's mentioned that not to get what one wants is suffering. Because if you think about that as being true, we could think then there's a couple different ways we could fix that. We could just make sure we get everything we want and we wouldn't suffer, though the chances of that happening are 0. Or we could lessen or attenuate what we want. If we have less desires, then there's bound to be less suffering as a consequence, because there's going to be, it will less often be the case that we don't get what we want. And whether it's practically possible, if we had no desires whatsoever, then at least in that sense, we wouldn't ever suffer. There wouldn't ever be a situation where we didn't get what we want. So I know some people don't like the idea of the origin of suffering, or dukkha. Some people don't like the idea of that being rooted in our own craving. And you can understand why. If you're sent to prison through no fault of your own, and you're completely innocent, you might think, well, my suffering isn't really due to anything I did. It's not my craving. It's due to these other circumstances. And this is where I don't want to say the Buddha's teaching can be harsh, but he's just extremely practical, because we might then we might think about that situation and wonder, well, what would you do? Especially if you knew you would never get out, or maybe even if you did, you'd still have to spend a couple years in prison or something terrible like that. I think what the Buddha is saying is that he's offering a path where we can still escape this dukkha. And when you think of it that way, it's a little more powerful, because there are injustices in the world, obviously, and we can be on the wrong end of that. And we can be bitter and upset, or we can try to some extent, apply the teachings of the Buddha, which we're going to get to in a minute, to see if we can lessen our own suffering in that sense. Now, for the third noble truth. Now this, bhikkhus, is the noble truth of the cessation of suffering. It is the remainderless fading away and cessation of that same craving, the giving up and relinquishing of it, freedom from it, nonreliance on it. Just to kind of restate the obvious, if we have no craving, and this word actually can mean thirst too, tanha. If we don't have that thirst, that craving, then suffering will not arise as a consequence. the origin of suffering and kind of the cessation of suffering, again, we can find reasons to rail against this. Certainly, there are biological reasons. I mean, the idea of thirst is a good one because we can't really overcome our biological craving for water. I mean, if we don't have water, we will die. And if we go without water long enough, I'm sure we will suffer as a result. And actually, if we, even long before we get to dying of thirst, our bodies can start to dehydrate, and we've probably all experienced that at some point. So I don't think that the Buddha is saying that I don't want to this is an instance where you don't, I think less is better, less speaking is better. But we could imagine that the Buddha is not telling us that we have to overcome every biological desire. Actually, the Buddha tells us to keep our bodies healthy. Without a healthy body, we're not going to be able to sort of amass the energy required to kind of walk the Eightfold Path and to lead a life. If we're just always, if we're kind of a nest of disease and achiness, and it's going to be very difficult for us to practice. Not impossible, but harder, obviously. But I do imagine on some level that we have to kind of resign ourselves to our situation. So, and I know, again, I hate to say things like this because we can start to paint the Buddha's teaching in a very negative way, but I think the reality is the Buddha's just trying to tell us that, we have a certain situation. Imagine, I don't know, I mean, imagine we're trapped in a cave somewhere and there's just no way we're going to get out, and we know we're going to die somehow. How would you prefer your last, days or however long you had to be kind of filled with anger and, kind of fear? Or would it be beneficial for us to have a teaching that might help us, that would help us achieve a great amount of calm? And so, again, I realize, dear listener, that when I say things like that, it could trivialize the Buddha's teaching, or you might think that it trivializes people's actual felt lived experience. I'm not trying to do that. I'm just trying to kind of point out some of the dimensions of the teaching here. I don't think I don't think there's at all a question that the Buddha did not think we should champion justice. The Buddha mentioned that part of right livelihood would be not dealing in poisons, to kill people, and one would not be involved in like the trading of slaves. So it's not that we're not trying to make an effort to make the world better, but we have to balance that out with the reality of our, our lives, our embodiedness. So that's what I'll say on that. Now, finally, the fourth noble truth. Now this, bhikkhus, O monks, is the noble truth of the way leading to the cessation of suffering. So that's a lot to say there. The Buddha is now telling us that, there's suffering, there's an origin of suffering, there's a cessation of suffering, and there's a way to get to the cessation of suffering. And what is that? He says, it is this noble eightfold path. That is right view up to right concentration. The noble eightfold path we just talked about. So what I want to say about this is, and this is something I meant to say at the beginning, this is extremely Buddha. This is very Buddhist. If we think about what we have discussed so far, that we should develop metta or loving kindness, and that we should follow this eightfold path, this middle path of the Buddhas, you would probably, or you would certainly be correct to say, well, almost every spiritual tradition wants us to love and has some degree of awareness that we have to have these different elements of, or we have to have these different practices that would make us ethically better and instill us with more, with deeper wisdom and, some amount of meditation or even prayer practices. But what we've just discussed, is extremely, is very unique to Buddhism. And what I think what we can really celebrate about it is that the Buddha does not tell us that, well, it's just your karma and you're going to have to wait for it to work itself out. It's not up to some God to bestow grace upon us. It's just a simple kind of almost user's manual. And I think it was in Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, where, and I forget his name. It is a Suzuki. I'm sorry. I'll put the author's name up. But he said the Buddha was just interested in baking bread. You follow the steps and you get bread. I think he even gave the example that sometimes you bake bread and you don't get bread, something happens. And I would say that that's when we don't, even when you think you're following the recipe, we may not be following the recipe. But the main issue here is that we have kind of an approach, and it's based upon just kind of an observation of our human existence, and that there is a way that we can increase, and there's a way that we can overcome dukkha or suffering. And another way to put that is there's a path for us to increase real joy, deep joy in our lives. Peace.